Awesome. It's great to be here with everybody from QallOut and my opponent. The most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. The larger the government, the smaller the individual. And when it comes to our complex tax system, the individual is effectively non-existent. Now, my opponent is going to be arguing for a progressive taxation system like we have here in the US. I will be arguing for a flat tax on consumption, sometimes called a national sales tax. Now, my main argument first is that progressive taxation is economically destructive. There's three reasons for this. The first is that it wastes money. The federal income tax code is 74,000 pages long and contains over 10 million words. And all of that complexity wastes astronomical sums of money as corporations and individuals try to figure it all out. According to the Tax Foundation, the complicated and burdensome tax code cost Americans $409 billion last year and 8.9 billion hours of lost work productivity. All of this money could be invested into things that actually matter, not wasted on an overcomplicated tax code. See, all of this complexity is removed with a flat tax on consumption because taxes are simply applied on purchases that you make. The second reason that progressive taxation is economically destructive is that it generates inaccurate results. There are endless interpretations of the tax code. Money Magazine took a hypothetical family's finances and gave the numbers to 46 professional tax preparers. 46 different estimates came back, ranging in differences of thousands of dollars for what the family owed. Now, these are professionals. Their only job is to understand the tax code, and they couldn't even figure it out. Now, the third reason the progressive taxation is economically destructive is because of corporate loopholes. See, thanks to the complicated tax code, corporations now spend over $2.6 billion annually lobbying for tax policies that they want. Additionally, they hire armies of accountants to deal with baffling formulas as they try to pay the least amount possible. This hurts small businesses because they don't have access to the accountants and resources that large corporations do. And it also harms low-income Americans because the debt that these corporations are creating by not paying their taxes gets pushed onto them. Now, another major argument here is that the IRS is just a monster. They have 79,000 employees at the IRS dedicated to managing the complex regulations they've created. And all of this power and influence creates the ability for them to abuse and target other individuals. We saw this when the IRS began targeting conservative groups and denying them nonprofit status. This only exists in a world where you have an extremely complicated income tax progressive system that enables all of these abuses to occur. That's why we should go for a flat tax, and I'll leave it to my opponent.
Okay, thanks, Austin. I appreciate this. Nice case. I look forward to getting to debate with you. So the first observation I want to make, I'll go ahead and agree with you that in the United States, specifically, the progressive tax is complex. It's overly complex. There's a lot of corporate loopholes, and lots of man hours and time and money is wasted on the notion, on this idea that there's like 74,000 pages, and so it is inefficient. However, my couple different responses to this right off the bat. And the first one, that this isn't unique to a progressive tax system. If you know anything about the United States tax system specifically, part of the reason it's 74,000 pages is not because it's so difficult to understand the idea of different brackets makes different amount of money. The reason for why the progressive tax system in the United States specifically is so difficult to understand and so complicated is because they have to calculate all the different possible forms of income, and there's so many different parts to the progressive income tax in the United States. However, in this debate, I'm not specifically advocating, or I'm not advocating for a specific progressive tax, not like the one in the United States. And a progressive tax could be very simple. You take your entire income for the entire year and you separate it into three brackets. People who make under $50,000 a year, they pay 0% tax. People who make $50,000 to $300,000, they pay a 15% tax, and people who make above that pay 25% tax. Now that's a very simple tax, and a very simple tax code that would be effective and will also be a progressive tax. So this notion that, and all of your arguments that are inherent flaws, quote unquote, with the progressive tax system are not actually problematic whatsoever. At least in the scenario that I'm defending them in. Obviously, the United States has made their government too large. The IRS has become, as you said, a monster, and the tax code is too big for these reasons. Now, the second argument that I want to take a look at, though, is why I think specifically the progressive tax is superior to the flat tax. Now, initially, I prepped that the flat tax was going to be just a flat tax on income. But it seems that you decided to talk about the fair tax, which is basically this idea that we impose a national sales tax. Is that correct? Okay, well, we'll talk about a national sales tax. There's a couple of reasons why I think an income tax is superior to a national sales tax. The first one is that a national sales tax distinctly hurts the poor people. So people who make under $50,000 a year, under $20,000 a year, whatever it is, in the progressive tax system, they don't pay any taxes. And we understand that when a poor person, pays 10% of their taxes, that's not very impactful to the United States government. 10% of $50,000 a year is $5,000. The government doesn't need that kind of money. However, $5,000 a year to somebody who's poor means a lot. So the trade-off for taxing somebody who's poor isn't worth it. Specifically, if you look at how this applies to sales tax, the sales tax specifically discourages spending and discourages consumption, because it says that in order for you to buy things, in order for you to use your money, in order to purchase things, you're going to have to pay 20 or 30% more in order to justify doing so. So it generates less money and it harms the poor. We'll elaborate next speech. It seems that Austin is having issues with his internet. It's okay there. We'll see what happens. So I don't know if you can hear me or not. If not, we don't need to restart. I'll just let my 3 minutes go from this debate, and then we can flip back to you. I just can't see you right now. You're not showing up. No, I cannot see you. Try, well, you got 2 minutes till you have to speak next. Try restarting your browser. Yes, it is indeed strange. Ah, there we go. Okay, so I can see you now. We're back. We're back in business. So if you spoke in your last speech, I didn't catch any of what you said. So what I'll do is I'll let this time run down. So basically, it just takes a total of flat 3 minutes off each of our speeches, and then we can just resume from there, and it'll be a 12-minute speaking time each instead of 15. Sound good? Is that cool? Okay, awesome. So in 1 minute and 19 seconds, you'll make the responses to the case that I just articulated. Because I obviously didn't catch them in the last 3 minutes that you spoke. Sorry about that.
Awesome. So if you can hear me now, I'll jump into it. Essentially, you argued that all of the problems I was outlining are not unique to a progressive tax rate. My first response is that they're exacerbated by a progressive tax rate, because when you have multiple tiers of income, that necessarily complicates things. They've been trying to fix this code for years and years, and it's only gotten more complex. But secondly, my second response is that it is unique to income tax. And you argue that essentially all the complexity is the same for every tax that deals with income tax. But that's not what a flat tax on consumption is. It's a national sales tax, so it doesn't take into account all of the income complexities that you've been talking about, which means all of my links and impacts still stand. Right now, we have a situation in which you can give tax numbers to 46 different professionals, and you'll get 46 different numbers back. That's a problematic situation and results to the loss in billions of dollars every single year as we try and figure all of this out. And it also enables all of the corporate loopholes that harm low and middle income families and small businesses because they can't compete against companies that have armies of accountants. Now, you also talked about how a sales tax is bad because it hurts the poor. 4 main responses. The first is non-basic goods. A national sales tax, a tax on consumption, doesn't apply to the basic goods that people in poverty are buying on a more regular basis. Things like water, basic food, doesn't apply to that. It's the same right now here in California. If I go to Ralph's and pick up a whole bunch of groceries, I'm not paying sales tax on those groceries that I'm purchasing because it's a basic need. But my second response is that of welfare. We have welfare programs in place specifically for this reason. If there are people who are in the lower income or in poverty, those welfare programs are there to help them so they can still survive and have access to the basic things they need. My third response is corporate loopholes. Your system actually harms the individuals you're claiming to help, because with corporate loopholes, you're harming small families by forcing them to shoulder the burden of taxes that large corporations really should be paying. So if we're going to talk about which situation harms the lower income individuals, it's absolutely the progressive tax rate. It's too complex for low income people to understand, for anybody who's not a major corporation to understand, and they have to pay more taxes than a lot of these corporations. My fourth response is actually a question. And that's because for the last 100 years, the progressive tax proponents have preached the ability of a progressive tax rate to close the rich-poor gap. But it hasn't happened. So my question to my opponent is, at what point in history are we going to see this tax solve for what you claim is the great underlying problem? I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, awesome. So right off the bat, you offer several responses to the complexity argument. And I think, however, so you argue firstly that it exacerbates the problem, and secondly that there are unique aspects to it in the sense that, you know, income is more complex than purchasing power, than like a sales tax. Specifically, the system that I've advocated for isn't something that you clearly addressed as solving the problem of complexity. If you have 3 tax brackets with set percentages, it becomes very, very easy to calculate your taxes. You look at your total income for that year, and then you say, do I make between X amount of money and X amount of money? If so, then this is the tax bracket that I'm under. So it's actually incredibly complex, or excuse me, incredibly simple. Obviously, the progressive tax system in the United States today is incredibly complex, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But I'm not defending specifically the United States progressive tax system whatsoever. I'm defending a different progressive tax system. So the complexity argument, I think, isn't one that's one that holds any water when you look at what we're actually advocating for under the resolution. The second argument, though, is that you offer these exemptions supposedly to the flat tax. Now, first of all, I'm not sure, if a flat tax just inherent to the definition allows for exemptions to be made. But if there are exemptions that are allowed to be made, I'd like to ask, what are these exemptions and why weren't they defined beforehand? If we're going to exempt things like food and water or electricity, well, where's the list of these things that we're going to be exempt from? And doesn't that also add like a layer of complexity if we're going to exclude certain items from the list? Here's ultimately what you don't answer. You don't answer the notion that under a progressive tax system that there is no complexity, specifically under my progressive tax system. Additionally, you don't answer the fact that the sales tax actually harms the poor. Poor people under my system don't pay any taxes whatsoever. However, under the progressive sales tax, under the flat tax that you've offered, poor people have to pay a set percentage. So it's undeniable that there's some sort of trade-off here where poor people get hurt by the fact that they have to pay a sales tax on the items that they purchase, whether it's necessities or whether it's some sort of other goods. Additionally, you haven't really offered a list of what things are actually exempt. There's three other arguments that I want to make, specifically about why the fair tax or the flat tax in this debate is a bad one. The first one is it disincentivizes spending. The number one booster of an economy is always cash flow. It's always money changing hand. And the fact that, and it's also undeniable that when you have a fair tax or when you have a sales tax on something, it discourages people from spending and makes them want to hold on to their money longer. That means that less people are buying things, which means less people are making money. That's not a good thing for the economy. In other words, these raised taxes on sales taxes disincentivize spending, which is the number one grower of an economy. The second thing is that this is just going to create a black market and make tax evasion a lot easier. If I don't have to pay taxes because I'm not a registered business, it becomes a lot easier for me to sell things when I don't have to pay taxes on them. If I have to pay 30%, or if I can give my customers a 30% discount, I'm absolutely going to sell them legally.
Right, so there's a main contradiction in your line of argument. You said I haven't provided enough specifics about what the flat tax on consumption is, but then you've argued that you're advocating for a progressive tax system under which there are no specifics. You basically said somehow we're going to take the over 70,000 pages of our progressive tax system and simplify it down to just a couple brackets. That's extremely simple. However, you haven't answered any basic questions about how this tax system is going to work. Do you have deductions in this tax system? Well, if they do, then that's a completely open can of worms for a whole new range of complexity. I don't think you can really point to very many countries that have been able to solve that problem with your system and also not jump into the harms that I've brought up. But my second response here is a turn of investments, because you argue that it could be simple, but you actually destroy investments when you follow a plan like yours. That's because progressive systems tax investment at multiple levels. The corporate income tax leaves an initial layer of tax at the business level, and then capital gains taxes and dividends taxes are then a second layer of tax at the shareholder level. So once combined, the two sets of taxes cause the tax rate on business investment to exceed 50%. Now, I don't know what you think is more important, but I definitely think business investment is significantly more important to a growing economy than whether people in the low income bracket can spend more money on food and on just basic necessities. So let's jump to the other point you made, which is I haven't named the exceptions. That's first because they're the exceptions that are under the current system. We have a sales tax right now in California particularly, and these exceptions are already there. They're just generally understood to be exceptions to a sales tax. Secondly, and I could talk about the exact plan, but I only have a 3-minute speech, so I can't go into all the details of what a tax plan would be about. But my second response is it's not any more complex. I go to Ralph's and they just don't charge sales tax on those items. It's something you don't even have to think about. It's just something that happens. Now, you said essentially that a flat tax disincentivizes spending. My first response is that's empirically denied because we see a booming economy even before the income tax was initiated in the 1900s. But my second response is that the progressive tax actually harms investment because you now are double taxing investment and making it harder for businesses to innovate and create new technologies that benefit everybody. We live a lot better than people did 30 years ago because of all the innovations that businesses have brought out. And that's the real harm when you tax investment at such a high level like the progressive tax does. But you still haven't responded to a few of my main points, which is that when you create a progressive tax system that uses all this complexity, like handling people's income and deductions, you create an IRS that has the ability to target political groups for their own end, which is an immoral thing to do. And you also create a situation that allows for corporate loopholes. You really haven't responded to how these corporate loopholes are actually the problem, and they're the ones harming the middle and lower classes here in America because they're not paying anything in taxes because they can, but small businesses don't have that advantage.
I'll really briefly address the specs argument. We both kind of are making arguments along the lines of, well, what are the specifics of the tax plan? I'll go ahead, and if you're okay with this, you can tell me if you're not or whatever. I mean, it's obviously ridiculous for me to assume that, oh, well, this means you're taxing food, because, you know, I could make infinite number of arguments and you could just basically say, oh, well, that's going to be exempt. On the flip side, you could say, you know, I'll say, well, it's actually not going to be complex because it has 3 tax brackets. And then you'll come back and say, actually, well, you're taxing corporate investment doubly. So there's going to be give and take in terms of the spec argument on both sides. So what I'll say is we'll get away from the specs on either side and we'll look, generally speaking, when it comes down to it, which ideologies are better. Progressive taxation, as it's generally understood, is the idea that you tax income on a scaled basis. In other words, those who make less money pay a lower percentage tax, and those who make more money pay a higher percentage tax. Complexity isn't a thing that's unique to that system. Complexity happens to be unique to the United States, but the United States has the most complex tax code in the world. There are other progressive tax systems that are not as complex as the United States one. So we'll say general advocacy. From a general perspective, generally speaking, which is a superior concept? This idea of the flat tax, or this idea that poor people shouldn't be taxed at the same rate that higher people should. Now, there's a couple different arguments then that we need to address. The first one is the fact that it's inevitable that you're going to harm the poor. Under a progressive tax system, the poor people do not pay taxes. And I can't stress this enough. The government does not need the amount of income that a poor person is going to spend. If a poor person spends $400 a month on, buying goods and services, and the government makes 10% sales tax on that, that's not that much money. It's going to be $40. However, $40 for that individual is going to be substantial. So we understand that in an economy, the value of 10% for somebody who makes a lot less income is substantially and exponentially more valuable than the government that could potentially tax it. So right off the bat, it's almost impossible for you to argue that this plan doesn't hurt the poor less than the progressive tax does, because the progressive tax doesn't tax them whatsoever. The second argument, though, is that your plan specifically raises prices for businesses and disincentivizes spending. Now, your one response is that, well, this didn't happen before the 1900s. Well, before the 1900s, we didn't have an income tax. We also didn't have really high flat taxes either, and the government wasn't very large. So the government didn't require that much money in order to operate. So just because that we didn't have an income tax before doesn't mean that a fair tax, or in this case, a flat tax, wouldn't actually harm people. We understand if you tack on 10% or 20% to every good and service that you purchase, that instantly raises the prices of those goods and services, and therefore discourages people from buying. And I can't repeat this enough. If it saves me 20% to keep my money in the bank rather than go buy things, that is bad for the economy and certainly not something that we should promote. In other words, the fact that you're harming the poor and the fact that you raise prices is a more impactful argument than the fact that a progressive tax code could be complex.
Right. So the entire idea that we're going to lower spending in America is, one, I don't think true, and secondly, offset by the idea that you're going to be increasing investment. And also, all the people who are now paying more for goods are also paying no income tax anymore. So it's offset in that way. But let's go over some of the specific points you brought up. In terms of specifics, yeah, it can get very convoluted, but my stance is pretty simple. Anything that's currently exempt, like groceries, are going to be continued to be exempt. Otherwise, there's a tax on it. But that does help the poorest people in America, because the things that they most need are the things that are going to be exempt. So you can't really get away from that key fact. You also talked about how under a progressive scale, everything's fair. My response, though, is it's an unfair scale. See, if we said we're charging everybody 20%, and that's the flat rate on their income, that's fair. But if you say we're going to charge some people way at the top 50% or 60%, it actually skews against those individuals in a way that I don't think is morally justified or practical. Let's talk about how you said I'm going to be harming the poor. My first response is that a progressive tax plan harms the poor. We can see this because it hasn't worked. We've had a progressive tax system in America for decades and decades, and it hasn't worked. In fact, income inequality has been on the rise since 1928. So my question still for you is, at what point in history, how many more years until we start to see your progressive tax system start to work in a way that actually helps those in the middle class and in the lower class? Because empirically, it just hasn't happened. So I'm always going to vote on the side of empirics over the side of strict conjecture. But there's also a second reason why your plan harms the poor, because it enables corporate loopholes that shoulder the burden of those taxes on people who are poor. Now, you're making the essential argument that people who are poor don't pay any taxes, so how could it get any worse for them? But you're ignoring the fact that wage mobility exists in the United States, and people who are poor right now statistically aren't going to continue to be poor in around 10 years. They're going to enter a tax bracket where they now have to shoulder taxes that should have been paid by corporations who got around those taxes because of the loopholes that you're enabling. Now, you also talked about how the government was different before 1909. Of course, that's true. It is a different government, but the founding fathers were strictly against an income tax, and they were strictly against it because of the violations of privacy and the amount of control that a government then has over its citizens. And that certainly hasn't changed. If we take a look at the IRS, which you still haven't responded to, we have an enormous body of over 70,000 individuals who are now targeting conservative groups, as they did a few years ago, precisely because of the amount of power that they have. So if we look at which side is actually helping the poorest in America, it's absolutely a national sales tax. It helps them because it doesn't enable the corporate loopholes. And it also helps them because they're going to be the beneficiaries of the innovation that occurs from continued business investment. All of those innovations are going to spur the economy a lot more than a few people at the bottom spending a little bit more on commodities.
Okay, so functionally we have to measure these arguments at the end of the debate round. The argument that you've offered, Austin, is basically that complexity is bad because it costs people money to understand the tax code. Now, we both have understood that I've not been arguing for the United States progressive tax system. The debate is not, is the United States current tax system superior to a flat tax? The debate is scaling income tax from the poor paying the least to the most wealthy paying the most superior to a flat rate tax. So all these arguments about how there's all these loopholes in the current tax code, about how the IRS is bad, are not unique to my side. They're unique to the United States tax system, but we don't see these problems existing in other nations where there's progressive tax systems. So there's a couple of different things we understand here. You make an argument about income inequality, and you basically say that, well, if the progressive tax system was so good, why haven't we gotten rid of income inequality? There's two arguments that I want to make in response to this. The first one is that there's a ton of reasons for why income inequality is still a thing, and a lot of reasons outside of the progressive tax system. And we can, we could list off reasons all day for why that was the case. But secondly, even if income inequality currently exists, doesn't mean you won't make it worse under the flat tax plan. See, you phrase it as if, oh, well, the progressive tax system doesn't solve the problem. The reality is, it's not about solving the problem. It's about which does less damage or which one is superior. And it's very, very clear to both of us that poor people are hurt substantially more when they have to pay taxes. When they have to pay 10% or 20% or whatever it is on the sales tax on all consumable goods, then whichever ones aren't exempted, then that's taxes that they have to pay that they previously did not have to pay, and that's problematic. The second argument, though, is that, and this is one you actually haven't addressed, is the black market argument. The argument that tax evasion now becomes the easiest thing in the world. It encourages people to sell things illegally because they can get away with actually paying the taxes, which means they can sell their items at a 20% or 10% or 30% discounted rate. You think the IRS is bad now? Just wait till the IRS has to crack down on all the illegal activity that's happening. The United States is not very effective, or any government is not very effective at regulating illegal sales. Just historically, they have a bad track record of doing it, which is why I think the flat tax is very, very poor. You ultimately raise prices and disincentivize people to spend money. You harm the poor, and you create a black market. And for those reasons, I think you should vote against it.
Right. So you argue that you're not advocating for the American system. That's, I guess, true, but you're arguing for a mythical tax system that isn't anywhere and hasn't been defined. And there are a few things you haven't defined. First, you haven't defined how deductions are handled. You haven't defined how income's calculated, and you haven't defined how investments are handled. And those are the three main areas in which all the complexity comes out. And they're necessarily going to come out when you have a system that's using income as its basis. So all of those complexities are still going to be there. But secondly, you talked about how income inequality has another source. First, you didn't provide what that source was. And the second is, right now, the top 1% in America pays almost half of all the taxes. So taxes are extremely high with a progressive tax system, and you haven't solved the problem. So are we going to raise taxes more? Is that going to help it? Your system hasn't worked at all in the past, and it won't work in the future. Lastly, you talked about tax evasion. Well, that's a huge problem, and the sales tax system is a much simpler solution than someone trying to cheat on income taxes where they can report just about anything. So I don't think you've ever heard someone say, I got away from Ralph's without paying sales tax.
Ultimately, this debate round comes to two arguments: the complexity argument and all the dissent that I run against the flat tax. The complexity argument, I think, is a wash. My system isn't necessarily a complex system. We've talked about how you could simplify very easily, and this is proven by the fact that the United States as being the only country referenced that we've talked about as being complex. There are progressive tax systems that do not have 74,000 pages. So the complexity issue, I don't think, is one that's necessarily problematic on my side. But even if you buy the argument that the progressive tax system is inherently complex, you still have to bite the fact that it puts taxes on the poor people who previously didn't have to pay taxes. It encourages people to buy things and sell things illegally, and it reduces the incentive for people to purchase things. And that's the lifeblood